Good afternoon, and welcome to the Healthcare Technology Insights podcast. My name is Dan Vogt. I'm a principal here in BerryDunn, and today I have the good fortune of serving as co-host of this episode.
Hello. Welcome to BerryDunn's Higher Education Huddle podcast. My name is Joe Trano, and I'm a senior manager with BerryDunn. I will be serving as a co-host of this episode as well.
Wait a second, Joe. I'm confused. What's happening here? Is this the Healthcare Technology Insights podcast or the Higher Ed Huddle?
Dan, I understand your confusion. This is a crossover episode of both podcasts. For our listeners, we have often found a number of parallels between higher education and healthcare. Both industries have mission-driven focus, are going through disruption and change in how they deliver their services, are seeking ways to demonstrate better outcomes and reduce costs, and are going through a technological evolution. So we thought it would be time to blend a topic that may be relevant to both higher ed and healthcare leaders.
That makes sense. Thanks, Joe. With that in mind, our very special guest today is Clint Davies. Clint Davies is the principal in our consulting group, one of the founders of consulting at BerryDunn, and an experienced consulting leader in both healthcare and higher education. He's guided healthcare and higher education institutions through major technology implementations, including enterprise resource planning systems, electronic health record projects, and other various major system initiatives. In addition to being a leader in consulting, Clint's also a pilot. He's been flying, I think, since he was 16 years old. He's flight rated, instrument rated, a flight instructor, and most of the time an aviation geek, from what I can tell. Because of this, when Clint is involved, there's rarely a meeting without an aviation reference or comparison. We thought for today's podcast it'd be interesting to ask Clint about lessons learned from aviation and how they can be applied to these large-scale software projects. Much like a pilot wants to land a plane smoothly and get all passengers to their destinations, health systems or higher education institutions want to implement successfully and not have projects that crash. So with further ado, let me welcome our guest, Clint Davies, or perhaps it's Captain Davies for today's episode.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Joe. Thank you both for having me here. As you described, I am passionate about aviation as well as the work that we do with clients. And so this is a topic that I love to talk about, and really pleased that you've invited me to join you, and we're going to have this conversation. So thank you.
Great. Clint, for our listeners, they may not be familiar with the side of you being a pilot. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about how you got into flying and what experiences it has taught you over the years?
Yeah, so thank you, Joe. As Dan mentioned, I started flying when I was a teenager. I was in high school and started taking flying lessons, and aviation really just captured my imagination. And aviation was a lot of work. It's many challenges, a tremendous amount to learn, and I found it really resonated with me. I had the good fortune to learn to fly out of a small grass field, and from some very experienced pilots, and to move on and to get my own ratings from becoming a private pilot while I was in college. I also earned my commercial and my instrument ratings, and actually became a flight instructor. And when I was in grad school, I worked as a flight instructor to work my way through graduate school, which was actually a lot of fun. So I've had a lot of background in it. I've continued as a flight instructor since grad school, mostly as a hobby. I have the dubious distinction of having several airplanes that I fly, and I really enjoy it all. And aviation has taught me so much, and I've been pleased to give some back. But one of the things that aviation has also really done for me is given me a very tangible exposure to risk management, to a lot of the challenges that we face every day in our work with clients who are trying to bring about change in their organizations, to implement new systems, to advance the practice that they bring, whether it be in healthcare or in higher ed. or in other industries, there's been some great lessons for me that I think that can really apply to the work that we see and we do with clients every day.
I think it's helpful for our listeners just to have a sense of, how you got into flying, the passion you bring to it, and the things you've learned. And I've had the fortune of flying with you a few times as a passenger, and putting myself in your hands, if you will, up at 10,000 feet or wherever we may be. One of the things I always find fascinating is how many checklists and procedures aviation uses. And I'm curious if you have any insight for our listeners around, checklists, standard operating procedures, and how those might be applied to large scale software projects like ERP or EHR system, and really any industry, higher ed and healthcare, certainly ones that our listeners are interested in.
Yeah, when we look at aviation today, and aviation truly is the safest form of transportation. I mean, the airlines have a tremendously good safety record, but it wasn't always that way, and that's been hard won to achieve it. And it's been many hard lessons that have been learned in the course of aviation history, and in how the industry has matured, how the discipline of managing the technology of aviation, the change of aviation, the people, and the systems that are so essential to aviation. And again, I think we've seen aviation do that really well. When things screw up, unfortunately, it makes the front page, and that's one of the things that has been a big driver in change. As a flight instructor, I get updates from the FAA. I'm very involved in accidents that do occur, and that lessons learned that improve aviation safety and our aviation operations. And that whole culture of safety is something that in aviation it pervades everything that goes on. And so I think that's really important. And again, I see there's similar sorts of culture in, especially in healthcare, when you come to patient safety and you're undertaking things that have inherent risk involved in it. And like aviation, the risks are can be very unforgiving of careless operations. And I see the same thing in other disciplines. If it comes to implementing major systems, for example, there's a lot of challenges. And one of the differences is that those challenges may be a little bit more subtle. In aviation, when you depart on a flight, you've got a limited amount of resources. You've got a flight plan, you've got fuel to get to your destination, to go to an alternate, and to hold for a certain amount of time. But that's not an indefinite amount of time. So you have to manage those resources. You have to manage the crew. There is a lot involved in operating a aircraft safely, and it's not just the cockpit crew that's involved. In aviation, we think of it as a system, and that system includes the pilot, the co-pilot. It includes the cabin crew. It includes air traffic control. It includes ground handlers. It includes management. And those are some of the components of that aviation system that, to me, stand out as similar to if you're delivering healthcare, or you're implementing new information technology systems in a higher education system.
I just want to maybe throw a follow-up question in there, Clint, if that's okay. You mentioned a number of interesting things as we think about, a university or a health system, or really any client implementing large-scale projects, right? You mentioned the importance of planning, with your fuel and your resources and your flight plan. You mentioned the importance of distinct roles and all roles being involved, with your captain and your co-pilot and your crew. You mentioned things like managing risk, like running out of fuel. if you're circling, you can only do it for so long. And I think you even mentioned alternate airport there. If I parallel that to any large scale software project, you've got a project sponsor, you've got a project manager, you may have subject matter experts, you've got that crew, right? You may have someone taking a look at it independently, like air traffic control, and making sure you're not crashing into one another. So there are some interesting parallels on what you're saying there. I'm just wondering if any one of those things, as you think about a recent software project, really jumps out to you as, hey, here's a place where software projects could grow from what aviation is already, hard fought, as you described it.
Yeah, I think there are some parallels. And if we follow this stream a little bit, you think about before the flight starts. I mean, it begins with planning. So, every flight has a flight plan. And it takes into account the destination and what the environment is like, what the weather is. You have requirements in aviation to have enough fuel on board to be able to reach your destination and have the weather change, not be able to land and fly to an alternate airport and make a safe landing there and still land with acceptable fuel reserves. So that's a very important safety element. And when you think about planning an ERP project, you have to have a sufficient resources, and those are certainly dollar resources, but they're also people resources. There's energy involved. There's a organizational capacity to undertake a big project and to make changes. And these are all aspects that occur. And if we look at each of those, each one of those in aviation, you recognize and you manage and you plan for, and you also anticipate that things may change, because once you launch, the weather may change. It may not be what's expected.
Clint, I think the question I have is related to what you just shared, and you talk about minimizing risk as much as possible and really having a good documentation on procedures. And one procedure that I'm interested in hearing from you is about a missed approach for a landing. I imagine there's a procedure for that. Could you explain this and how it might apply to an ERP or an EHR project and go live event?
Sure. So when you think about it, when you're on an airline flight, the crew is planning to get to the destination, and when they depart, they have weather information. They have the status of the equipment on the airplane, and if some of those things change, it's possible that the crew and the airplane may not make it to its intended destination as planned. I mean, you may run out of resources, out of capacity here, and so much is dependent on that. And this is where, in the culture of aviation, we've looked at accidents that have occurred, and we've seen how some of these things factor into accidents. So crews are trained to take all these factors into play. When they're doing an approach to land, and the weather is not as good as expected, and it's below minimum landing conditions, the crew is trained and prepared to make a change, and that usually is flying the missed approach procedure. That's what we call it, the missed approach, which is a very structured, intended, planned procedure. So it's not something that it's a contingency that is well prepared for, and the crew has some options as to how they manage it. If they have enough fuel, they may come around and fly another approach, and they may know why they could not land, and they may be able to change whatever it was. Perhaps they know that the weather is improving, and they'll be able to land on their second attempt. So that's a viable change they may make. It may be that the fog is going to be too low and it's going to stay in over the airport for too long and they're going to have to go to another airport. And they've already identified that contingency in advance. And when we think about this in comparison to implementing an enterprise project, an enterprise resource planning system, for example, you have to be truly objective about the readiness of the team to go live or to achieve the milestones. You have to gauge the progress and you have to make decisions. Are we ready to pull the trigger and go live? If we're not, what is the contingency plan? And identifying those contingencies and bringing some judgment into it and doing it in light of some predetermined criteria is really a way to achieve a successful outcome. And that successful outcome may be landing at the destination, or it may be going to an alternate, refueling, and then arriving at the destination. So those are the sorts of things that you have to think about and plan for in advance.
Clint, I like your comment around kind of the criteria being established in advance for go live in a software project, much like the procedures and the rigor you described of landing the airplane. And I think one of the things you've described to me over the years is the importance of trusting your instruments, right? That you may, when flying, perceive something different than what's actually happening, right? Your body may be tricking you. You may think you're going up and you're actually going down, right? And you need to use those instruments and the data they're presenting to you to make decisions and trust them, not trust the false perception, right? And I think in an implementation project, we may have similar things. Like we may think a project's going great, but if we look at the risk register or the decision log or the status report or a survey of the project participants, the data, the instruments of a project may tell us something different, right? And I don't know if you can kind of explain a bit more about that. And again, that I imagine it's hard to trust the instruments when your body's telling you something else, much like it's hard to fight the data the project's telling you if you think it's going okay.
I think that's a good analogy. And in the cockpit, we have a dashboard with multiple instruments on it. And one of the things we teach pilots to do is to continually cross-check to make sure that those instruments are indeed working correctly, are indeed giving you true information. And it's not unlike a dashboard in a implementation project where you're looking at multiple metrics and you have to gauge each one and determine do they line up properly? Is it telling you the whole picture, the whole story? And that's a big part of both flying and in the implementation of systems, for example. The differences is that in the implementation of systems, it can be much harder to determine the status of certain aspects, and there are more subtle indicators. In an airplane, it's actually things are if you are managing it correctly, you can determine very quickly whether all your instruments are working consistently. Whereas in when you're dealing with a lot of variables of different people, systems, change management, procedures, that can be a little bit harder to determine, but it's just as important.
Clint, thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. Something that you mentioned earlier about missing an approach for landing maybe due to weather, and in some cases you may need to go to an alternate airport. So I believe that there's a technique in planning of alternate airports that likely is part of your flight plan. Can you maybe describe for our listeners what that is and how it could help them with software implementations?
Well, first off, starts with having a plan, and it's you have to have a plan, and things may change, and you may have to change the plan, but you can anticipate what some of those things could be. And when it comes to implementations, it can be building that plan can be a little bit more complex. It involves a lot of different pieces of information, but you have to start with that plan. And then you have to think about what factors and how can you gauge whether you're on track. I mean, are you on course? Are you consuming your resources at the expected level, or is something happening? Are you facing more headwinds? Change headwinds, for example, people, not being prepared for change and not learning new systems and making decisions around that. So I think that's important. I think we've got some other factors in aviation that also play into this. So one of the things that's really important in aviation is teamwork and the crew working together. And in the last few decades, we've implemented in aviation a concept called crew resource management, where you really are the crew communicates in a certain way. Everyone has a job to do. They're cross-trained as well. They understand the roles. Leadership is very important in aviation. So you've got a captain, you've got the first officer. They are in many cases interchangeable, but still there's one pilot in command. So you've got someone who can call out that, hey, we've got a problem here. You've got that team has learned how to communicate with each other, so they know how to be hard on the issue without necessarily letting emotion get in the way. So, for example, then this has been a factor in accidents where people saw something but they weren't comfortable communicating it, and flight crews have learned how to use the right language. And the captain is trained when the co-pilot says that he's not comfortable that the airplane is properly configured in the approach. The captain may decide that she's going to fly the missed approach, and she has to do that without hesitance. And that's the sort of thing that I think goes a long ways towards making the crew function properly, and it leads to a predictable, safe outcome. So communication, leadership, teamwork, these are all critical factors in both aviation and in any system implementation effort.
Yeah, Clint, you hit on some really important things that I could see, obviously, in a flying situation, but also could see in an implementation of software, right? And one of the things that really struck me listening to that is trust. In addition to the communication and everything else, trust and a culture that allows for the communication you describe, right? And so if the co-pilot mentions to the pilot that they don't see something quite right, they have a culture that allows for that, and a culture that does the right thing next, right? And can that be applied to the cultures of client situations? How do they establish that sort of expectation norms at the start of an implementation project? How does a sponsor get feedback from a project manager that things aren't quite right, or from a stakeholder group? Any thoughts on what it takes to kind of get those norms working? I mean, aviation's been doing it a while, but if for a client thinking about this, how do they have some open discussions around that at the beginning?
Yeah, I think those can be challenging topics, but there are some lessons that can be drawn from that, Dan. So, one of the things that occurs is before every flight, there's a briefing, and it makes sure everyone is on the same page. There's a clear understanding and a shared view of what the mission is, what the goal is, what the critical factors and as you mentioned, that culture of safety, because there's a lot of risk if you fail. And we've seen that play out, unfortunately. So in the aviation environment, we really have developed the concepts that can be applied. I think from the planning, the briefing, the communication, how people communicate with each other, and then the debriefing. So after every flight, there's always a debrief of here's what worked well and here's what lessons we've learned. And I think that if we apply those same concepts into an implementation or any major change effort that's being undertaken, we can get everyone on board, understand what the goals are and the objectives are, understand what it's going to take, understand the flight plan that it's going to take, and then working together and make sure that people they also have to have the skill to do their job. So that takes training. And we'll talk about that in a moment, perhaps. But then at each stage, a debriefing of here's how it's going, here's what we've learned for lessons, here's what we need to change going forward, or in the next flight, or in the next stage of the implementation, for example. Those are all applicable lessons that I think can apply.
The concept of the training, I think, is important to maybe highlight a little bit. Can you speak to the importance of training, whether it's annual or otherwise, and the positive reinforcement of good behaviors, good procedures in aviation, how that may apply to a software implementation? Where do you draw the parallels there?
Yeah. Training is a huge part of our culture in aviation, and it's not just an initial training, but it's also the fact that every 6 months, an airline flight crew has to spend a couple of days in the simulator practicing for all of those procedures that don't normally occur, but that could happen. And so that helps them stay proficient. And that's a big part of it. I think in technology implementations, people need to take the time to develop. They need the training, and it needs to be structured training. They need to be able to demonstrate that they can understand how to use the systems and how the new procedures are going to work, and that they can follow those. In aviation, the flight crew gets graded on their abilities to do those things, and that's just the norm. It's part of the culture, and having that level of proficiency so that they can do it every time is important. And I don't think we've seen as much of that when it comes to software implementations. It's not that people are unwilling. It's just they don't necessarily have the structure and have the culture that at multiple levels need to occur. So I think that's where some of the discipline, some of the maturity of practices and procedures from aviation could be applied well into implementation projects.
Great, thanks.
I was struck by a discussion we had a little bit earlier on this episode, and I think it sets up my next question for you, Clint, pretty well. We talked about the alternate airport concept a little bit, and I just been thinking about it in light of enterprise software projects, right? An alternate airport in a software implementation might be a different go live date, right? You might have planned on October 1st, but in your advanced planning, you said we could also go live February 1st. So if we delay, we already know our alternate airport. Our alternate airport is a different go live date. Or we might have planned for a big bang ERP go live, right, for everything. But the conditions change, much like you described the weather. And instead, we're going to go with the general financials first, and then the HRS second, and then maybe we get out to a student system or something else later, right? So you pivot to a phased approach. And that might be a strategy you have in your advanced planning as well. As software alternate airport. So, the tactics are different, the concepts are different, but the idea of knowing it in advance what you'll do if the conditions change, at least some hypotheticals, it is helpful. And I share that to tee up my next question, which is around continuation bias, right? Kind of this concept that we're going to keep going. It's an aviation concept, it's a psychology concept. It's sort of this bias as you can keep going with the original plan despite the conditions changing, right? And this is where I think, unfortunately, some of the crashes in aviation have happened. And I know in my career, I've seen this mindset lock in with on projects, right? The sponsor is sort of locked in. We're going to go live no matter what, despite all the risk registers being read, despite everyone being concerned, despite all the conditions have changed, but they're still locked in on the go live date. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, because I think it can be important for a client to be able to step back objectively and say, is that setting in, and have an open discussion around it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Dan, that continuation bias can be a very dangerous thing. And in aviation, we have it goes by several different names, but it's sometimes it's called get home-itis, or it's the focus so much on the mission. And in most of our flying, the mission is not worth the risks that it could bring. So when we're one of the things we do in aviation is we teach people about this. We teach about the human factors, time pressure, the sense of being goal oriented, and this impacts a lot of aviators. Is because to be successful at a challenging discipline, you have to be goal oriented. You have to work hard and focus on achieving the goals. And that can, there are times where that same aggressiveness about being goal oriented can be a tremendously dangerous thing. And we've seen a lot of accidents that have been caused by pilots that are just so focused on the goal that they miss the warning signs, the indications of problems, and they push the fuel reserve, and there have been many accidents that have arisen because the pilots thought they could make it another 15 miles, and they ran out of fuel short of their destination. So that's the sort of thing that we talk about in aviation, and we try to be really focused on the what's at stake, and the procedures, the standards that I've talked about, the requirements to have fuel reserves, for example, but also not just that, the human factors. When we have limits, we have, as a flight instructor, I can only fly 8 hours in any 24-hour period. A airline crew has a 14-hour duty day, so they can't push themselves beyond that. And sometimes frustrating to be standing at the gate waiting for your flight and have the crew time out. But you're better off for it, because you don't want people making bad decisions. It's, in an implementation effort, I can't think of a single go live that hasn't come down to some questions about, is everything perfect? And you never have everything perfect, just like you never have perfect weather, and you never have perfect equipment, and you certainly don't have perfect people. But you have to make decisions, and you have to make those in light of the objectives and the parameters which are going to be successful. So it's not good to push to go live and have everything fail just because you were trying to go live. At the same time, you have to be able to gauge: do you have the energy? Do you have the resources? Do you have people sufficiently trained when there are problems? And there always are problems. When those problems arise, are they things that can be managed? In aviation, we do have provisions for minimum equipment lists. So you can have certain failures on an airplane that will not affect the safe outcome of a flight. We have backup systems, and So those are some of the decisions that, that the crew, and not just the crew, but it also is the dispatchers, again, management of the airline creates a culture of, are they trying to get to their destinations at all costs, or are they managing safety as well as service and the other aspects of successful flights and transportation experiences? We can talk about the airlines a lot, but the things that the airlines know how to do well is to not kill people and to get people there efficiently. It may not be always on time, but it's for the most part, our record of aviation safety is pretty good.
Clint, I can speak from a healthcare perspective, and this is a crossover, episode here between our higher ed and healthcare podcast. But I can think about, hospital and health systems that, maybe they didn't crash the plane when they went live, but they caused such financial distress, let's say, because they couldn't bill for such a long time that they're borrowing against their investments and potentially leading them to not be an independent hospital anymore, which they might consider a crash, if you will, of the plane, right? And so my follow-up is a lot of the things you mentioned there, I would think would be great things to talk about at the very start of the project. So if you're sitting down with the board or you're sitting down with the leadership team and you're talking about, here's the project we're about to do, and what are those big risks that we need to avoid? We can't crash the plane, right? It doesn't need to be perfect, but we can't crash the plane, right? Do you think an honest conversation about continuation bias and the things that could happen at the very start, would be beneficial if you're sitting down with a board or a management team? And how might you start that conversation with them, to really get this in their thinking?
Yeah. I've often used the words when I've been talking with clients and with boards like this, that a major implementation project is a lot of problems flying in close formation. And, recognizing that at the outset, that this is a challenging undertaking. It's an important undertaking. It's something that you need to do because you need to have the benefits of new technology. But it's not without some hard work. And then laying out a realistic plan, thinking about contingencies, thinking about people, making sure that you backfill for people at critical times so that they can do their job during the implementation. It's not unlike my job when we're traveling to a client, and I have two hats. One is my consultant hat, and the other is my hat as a pilot, as aviator. And I have to make sure that I'm able to do both jobs effectively. And I think clients need to think about it the same way. When they've got people that are implementing a new system, they've got to be able to do that effectively. And they also still need to handle their day job, or the day job needs to be handled by someone. And this is where you want to think back about the crew concept. So you don't want just people taking on humongous tasks all by themselves. It needs to be done as a team, as a crew, and it needs to be managed intentionally, purposefully, and then you're setting yourself up for success. So if you start out recognizing what it's going to take, preparing for it, understanding that not everything will work smoothly, but that you're prepared to identify problems and address them quickly, giving yourself room in the implementation plan, for example, so that you can stay on course and achieve the implementation results successfully. The other thing to also keep in mind is live operation is one destination, but it's not the ultimate destination. It's really going to be that process of continuous improvement, because after a system is implemented, you go live, historically people would say, "Oh, we're all done with that," but that's not the case, because you're going to continue to refine processes. You're going to become better at it, and you need to become better at it. So you need to continually learn how to change, how to adapt, and how to really be better at what your core focus is.
No, I can appreciate that, and I can certainly see the parallels with higher education as well. And as we all know, these ERP projects can be multi-year long projects that require a lot of planning, a lot of adjustments along the way to course correct or make sure that if things do come up that present a greater risk, that they get addressed. So the long-term destination is met. So I can certainly see those parallels, Clint, as you described the aviation piece of what you do. I have a follow. We're running close to the end of our time here. I wanted to just ask you a follow-up question, and that is, we've touched on a lot of topics. We've asked a lot of questions related to aviation and flight, and some really good takeaways for our listeners. So I'd like to maybe just close with a final question for you, and that is there anything that we didn't touch on that you feel is a really important point to make regarding aviation, and maybe drawing a parallel to a major software implementation in higher ed or healthcare?
Boy, we've talked about a lot here. So we've talked a little bit about planning. We've talked about the importance of leadership and teamwork. We've talked about training. Training to not just understand what a system can do, but really to proficiency. We've talked about integrating procedures and the need to have everyone involved in the system be on the same page and be working towards the same goals, and to recognize when problems arise and how to communicate and to speak up in the course of that. These are all some of the things that we found in aviation. I think we've hit on so many of these points here. It's a great opportunity, and aviation just has brought so much to our world when you think about it. I mean, the ability to get on an airliner and fly across the country or across the ocean, is something that we've never had before until this era that we're in now, this age that we're in today. And we are seeing the same sorts of dramatic advances in information technology that we've had in aviation. It's the capabilities that new systems give us, if properly implemented and approached in the right way and managed, is just tremendous. And it gives us capabilities that we couldn't have imagined a few generations ago. And the same thing in aviation has done that. Technology has been a big part of aviation. A lot of the changes in technology in aviation have been brought about by technology in the last few years, and it's really amazing to see, and we're seeing the same thing happen across multiple industries. I mean, I think about the importance of patient safety and the ability to use technology to improve outcomes for patients, to better deliver healthcare, is just tremendous. I think of where higher education is going, and I think of the student systems that are now being developed, that are on the horizon, the ability to really improve the student experience and to make education more accessible to people. I mean, these are tremendous benefits. So I think the goal is worth it. It's if we can do it and enjoy the journey a little bit too, that's a plus.
Thank you so much, Clint. Dan and I were thrilled to have you join us today on this crossover podcast. This was really great. And I think the insights that you shared with our listeners, I think will really help them think through some of their major software implementations that they have and be able to draw upon some of those parallels in aviation where you have some really structured procedures and steps, checklists, those things I think all can be certainly applied to major software implementation if you're not thinking about those already. I know our clients, hopefully are planning and preparing for their implementation in a way that's, going to lead to success. So we really appreciate you sharing those insights. And we hope that the insights that you did share today will help our listeners, as I mentioned, really keep their software projects on a safe flight plan with a smooth landing at their destination. How do you like that?
Well, just thank you, Joe. This was actually a lot of fun. I really, as Dan said at the outset, I always, love aviation and I'm enthusiastic about it. And I'm really enthusiastic about the future that we see for healthcare and for higher education. So this was a lot of fun putting this all together. So thank you both.
Thank you. For our listeners, you can find our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google. I'm Joe Trano.
And I'm Dan Vogt.
And you've been listening to the BerryDunn Higher Education Huddle and Healthcare Technology Insights podcast. Thank you for listening. Be well and stay insightful.